Good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this latest Indica Books Q&A. This time I have great pleasure in welcoming and inviting author Aditi Banerjee again. And I say again because a few months back we had spoken when her book Hindu Love Stories, Dharmically Ever After had come out. And it gives me great pleasure now to share that we are going to be in discussions with Aditi about her latest book. Yes, her latest book called The Vow of Parvati, The Story of a Love Reborn. And I don't think you need any introductions to this Puranic episode, but seeing it come alive in this wonderful retelling by Aditi, I thought it would be great to have a chat with her, talk about the things that we normally do in these Indic book Q&As, the story, the process of writing, where her sources, inspiration come from, and a whole lot of other things. And also the fact that here at Indica Books, we have got copies of her book, and we are going to be sending out these copies to the 1000 Reviewers Club 2022 edition. In case you're wondering what this 1000 Reviewers Club is, it is, as the name suggests, a reviewers club where we invite anyone in India to become a member, and we over the course of a year will send 5 or perhaps 6 or even more books to people with absolutely no obligations other than that they write a review once they get the book, and they post it on an online platform like Goodreads or Amazon or elsewhere, and they let us know. We don't ask that you write a positive review. Of course, if you like the book, we'd like a positive review. But if you don't like the book, you're more than free to criticize the book also, as long as you do it coherently, cogently, logically, and you articulate your reasons well. You can follow us at Indica Books on Twitter. We have a Facebook group. You can follow us. You can join the group there. We have a YouTube channel where we collect and we post all of these videos of author interactions, roundtables, and so on. So I'm not going to take any more time, and I will invite Aditi to this author Q&A.
Namaste, Abhinav. So good to be with you here today.
Absolutely, likewise. So before we get into this, I have a question. See, your first book, the Curse of Gandhari, came out in the third quarter of
2019.
2019, right?
Yeah.
And then COVID struck and everything, and we didn't hear about any book from you for 2 years, and then 2022 seems to be the year when you have decided that enough with COVID, one has to get back to writing and writing seriously. And obviously, both these books would have been in the works for several months. You just don't get up one morning and you decide to write a book and you finish the book by evening. But Hindu Love Stories came out a few months back, and now Bloomsbury has come out with their second book of yours, which is The Vow of Parvati. So first of all, tell us, were you working on both these books at the same time, or how did the Vow of Parvati come about?
So actually, I Hindu love stories I wrote in a storm. So I started it in about November of last year, so November 2021, and I wanted to release it by February. So I just wrote that very intensively in a storm. Vow of Parvati, I started around the time of my marriage. So when The Curse of Gandhari came out, Indica had actually sponsored a book tour, and that was like right before my husband and we got married. So like the first week or so, we did the book tour, and then we got married. And we actually got married in this place, Triyugi Narayan. It's this ancient temple a few hours away from Kedarnath, and that's where they say Shiva and Parvati had gotten married. So the sacred flame from their wedding actually still burns there today. So being in that place, and I'd always thought if I ever get married, that's where I would like to get married. And so a big part of the inspiration for the book came from being there. And then I had also done a Somvar Vrata for Shiva and Parvati, for a year or so before the wedding, so that everything goes well, so to bring, auspiciousness and harmony. And so I was very much in this. I had this bhava for Shiva and Parvati, even though I'm a Krishna Bhakt at heart, but that's the beautiful thing about Hinduism. You don't have to choose one or the other. And so I was really inspired by the story of Shiva and Parvati, and I wanted to write something like an homage to them. And I wanted to write it in a bit of a different way. And what I really wanted to bring out was, I think, the Leela aspect of our devas. And what I was thinking about is I've started actually watching some like Asian dramas and Chinese dramas, and often they have these Taoist or Buddhist dramas where they show like the stories of the gods and things like that, or what are happening in their heavens in a very beautiful way. And what I wanted to do is what kind of take some of that and then also keep the sacred element in it and show that aspect of it. So for example, you can think of Shiva and Vishnu as both being aspects of the same Ishvara or Bhagavan. But it's also very fun or beautiful to see their relationship together. So a big part of this book is actually showing the relationship between Shiva and Vishnu as two devas. And that's kind of like the Leela aspect of it. And there's so much beauty in that that I think we don't explore enough. And so that's what I really wanted to bring out in this retelling. So I started that in about 2019, and then the publishing was slow. But I also had like another writing project in between where I finished a draft of a novel, put it aside, came back to it, and I just couldn't get to the point where I said it's ready. So there's a novel that's in a drawer in my desk that took up some of that time between 2019 and 2022, which I hope to come back to someday.
So you have been busy the last 2.5 years since the release of the Curse of Gandhari, and uh, obviously, best wishes and congratulations on your wedding from 2019. But coming to the Vow of Parvati now, what has been now? I know that you're very very meticulous about the sources that you use for your books. What's your primary source for the Vow of Parvati? Which Puran?
A Shiva Purana. So I did a close read of the Shiva Purana in English, an English translation, and that was the source for the material. So whatever is in the Shiva Purana, for the most part, is in this book. And then there are some other Puranic sources for little bits and pieces here and there, and then
Ah,
some of it is just my imagination also.
of course, of course. Great. Uh, so now, tell me when. Tell us about. See, we know the broadly speaking, we know the story of Shiva and Parvati, and more than that, I think for the story of Shiva and Parvati to begin, we have to begin with the story of Uma and Sati. How much of so when writing this, right? There's obviously eh, I hate to use the word, but there are elements of a modern family soap opera thrown in there, for lack of a better word. I mean, there is Daksha, who's not exactly the best of fathers-in-law, and then there is this very very protective and fiercely independent Uma. And then there is the story of Shiva, who tries to be aloof from it to the extent he can, but obviously when Uma commits sati, then he doesn't.
Yeah.
So tell us. I mean, I whenever I read this, it's like so incredible. I mean, here is a Shiva who's the symbol of detachment, who's he's and yet you have this person who's literally driven to depths of despair at the death of his wife.
Yes. So this is actually what I struggled with the most while writing this book, because there are two aspects here. One is Shiva and Shakti, divine, um, they're Ishwara and Ishwari. So there's something sacred and very non-human about them. So they're not subject to like the human tribulations and frailties and things like that that we are. Yet at the same time, I think what is unique about our devas are they're also relatable in a way. So in the path of bhakti, one stage is you have just awe, and another stage is when they become like family to you. And even though they're not human and we should never mistake them for being like a human family, like the soap operas that we see today, I think part of the reason these stories are there from the Puranas is for us to draw ideals and certain inspiration and be able to relate to them in different ways. So in a very abstract way, and then also in a very intimate way. And so the Shiva Parivar, which is very iconic, with Shiva, Parvati, Kartik, and Ganesha, is the ideal family. And even today, so many of us perform vratas, and women pray to have a husband like Shiva. That's the ideal marriage, the ideal family for us. While at the same time there were so many struggles and things that they went through, again not in a human way, but I think that's part of the aspect of Leela. And I think for us, what that is, the lesson for us is not that the devas are down at the human level, but as humans we should always think of how can we transcend and elevate ourselves above the soap opera level. And that's kind of what I was aiming for. And this idea that Shiva and Sati are both independent, self-sufficient on their own, and yet they come together in something that's beautiful and greater than the sum of the individuals themselves. So my favorite actual image of Shiva and Parvati is, there's a very common image where they're both standing on a mountainside, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and they're both looking out at the world together. And there's a sense of a partnership and a mutual respect and just a very beautiful bond in that I've always found very, very inspiring. And I think that's still relevant today. So, um, I think what makes us different from, let's say, Greek mythology or Roman mythology is the Greek gods aren't necessarily, they're very human in their sense, they're very entertaining stories and things like that, but they do not have that same metaphysical, philosophical dimension that the Hindu pantheon does. And that's why, they're still relatable to us, but they're still very sacred, important lessons to help us transcend and take us towards moksha and enlightenment that come from these stories, which is what makes Hinduism unique and special in that regard, or the dharmic traditions in general.
And I suppose that is because, unlike the Greek legends, that they didn't really get a chance to live and grow and develop, because that ancient Greek civilization itself came to an end, and therefore the stories, the traditions, the rituals were all frozen in time
Yeah,
till they were sort of they got a new home, so to say, in European, in the collective consciousness of European civilization. But our Hindu traditions and these stories, they kept on growing, they kept on maturing, they kept, people kept on learning from them, and in some ways I think kept on adding back to them also, because which is why I would suppose that the reason why the Puranas were composed over a period of more than 1,000 years, I think, is also reflected in the Puranas themselves. Uh,
very true.
so, but in in terms of, see, when you wrote about the characters of Uma and Parvati, how do you define, or how? Okay, let me put it this way. From the Puranas themselves, from the Shiv Puran, for instance, what inspiration did you get in terms of deciding how you wanted to etch each character? Because they are different characters, but they are also in many ways similar.
So, do you mean specifically with Uma and Parvati?
Correct.
Yes. So I think I think it's the sense is there just in the depiction of Sati as being, she's a beloved daughter of Daksha, so she's very gentle, beautiful, refined. That sense is kind of there implicit in the Puranas, and so that's how the first half of the book with Sati is depicted. And for her, I think it's this tension between her attraction towards Shiva and also her love for her father, and that's what causes the great crisis at the Daksha Yagya. And then when she's reborn as Parvati, it's the same, I would say, essence and attributes, but I think the difference is now she has a greater resolve, and so she knows what she wants, and she wants to win over Shiva. She wants to attain Shiva, and so even though her mother cries out, the way she gets the name Uma is her mother crying out, "Do not go, do not go," because she goes always to the forest and is committing these penance and all of that, even though her mother does not want her to, even though it's not conventional, even though she has no idea she will succeed, even though Shiva is there completely indifferent to her. So I think she comes into her own, and I think that's part of her growth from Sati and Uma to becoming Parvati, and it's really the completion of that story that starts at when she's Sati and through the Daksha Yagya, and through the separation, and then this the reunion that comes about once she's Parvati.
So both are Uma and Parvati both are very strong-willed, independent-minded women, but and yet it is Uma who decides to end her life unable to take this insult of her husband at the hands of her father-in-law. How do you explain this? I mean, how do you how do you try and understand this act?
It's um it's it's hard to describe. I think it's a demonstration of her utter devotion. And in that moment too, she's in control. So sometimes I think nowadays in modern things we see women being depicted as very emotional, and at the moment the way it's described in the Shiva Purana, she doesn't just like throw herself into the funeral pile. She's not overcome with emotion. It says she actually does pranayam. She controls herself, she controls her senses, and she withdraws from her body. And it's not clear whether she's at the edge of the altar or she actually immolates herself. But at that moment, I think what happens is she realizes that this conflict between her father, Daksha Prajapati, and Shiva is irreconcilable, and that by coming there, she has made a mistake, and she has been witness to this insult of her husband, and that is not something she will tolerate. And so she makes this decision, and she ends her life. Um, so I don't see that as being in conflict with her being strongly willed, because it's an exercise of her willpower. And I don't think we should see devotion to a husband or love for a husband as being somehow contradictory to being independent and self-willed, because she chooses that out of her love for Shiva, which is why it makes it such a poignant and very moving sacrifice, and very very tragic, um, and also what makes her who she is as Devi.
Uh, Let me jump to another part. So there is also the story of and uh, Brahma and Tara that you talk about. and Parvati, I think it is Parvati, right, who goes to Brahma, and then uh, you mention the fact that uh, Tara was an impetuous one. Brahma is obviously the more sedate one.
Oh, Brihaspati
Sorry, what am I saying? Brihaspati, yes, Brihaspati and
and
Tara.
Tara.
And uh, tell us a little bit about that part, because there are so many subtexts, I believe, hidden in that particular episode, particular story itself.
Yes. So the story in short that there was Tara who was married to Brihaspati, and Chandra Deva had fallen in love with her. He took her away, and she has also become attached to him. But then Brihaspati and the Devas wage this war, and they bring Tara back. And so that's kind of the story. It comes in many variations across the different Puranas, but at the core of it, that's what it is. And it's uh, so it's an interesting story. So Tara's kind of thought of as being very impetuous. She's very, she's in the stars, and she's very uh, has emotions and a high passion. Brihaspati, of course, is very like scholarly. He's the guru of the devas. So he's very aloof in that way. And so the idea was that Brihaspati was teaching Sati, and Sati came to their home, and this one element I wanted to bring out of it is you can think of it as being a sad story or something like that, but perhaps Tara and Brihaspati belong together because there's a balance there, and maybe they balance each other out. And one of the themes of the book is that there's a balance between Shiva and Sati, Shiva and Parvati, where in many ways they seem to be opposite or have very different qualities, but they bring that balance to each other. Where, um, I feel like it's Shiva that can bring out the aspects of Ma Kali or Ma Durga that are there in Sati, and Sati can bring out some of the gentler aspects of Shiva, and so he's also this renunciate, but he's also this has a family. And so the idea of finding balance between relationships and connections. But there are many other subtexts in that story.
On that note, on Shiva's note, I want to ask you a question about the family itself. But before that, do you have a favorite passage you'd want to read out for our viewers?
Sure, I do. And this passage comes from it's the first part of the book where Sati is going to it's the night of Shivaratri in effect, and Sati in Devaloka is about to go to the assembly hall where all the devas, all the rishis have assembled for worshiping Shiva. So let me see. Uh, Sati dressed in a pale yellow sari with no ornaments. It was not a night for jewelry or gems. Rudra brought out the asceticism in the devas. They walked slowly to the assembly hall. Sati remembered that moment on the mountaintop with the howling of the wind and the churning of the sea, all that energy and action. Now all of that kinetic frenzy stilled on into a thick silence that blanketed Mount Meru. The wind did not move, not a single leaf fell from a tree branch. Even Daksha was unusually mute, his eyes flitting this way and that as they walked, as if Rudra would pounce on him for not behaving properly. He made it a point to mutter the mantra of Rudra audibly, as if to prove his devotion. Sati smiled wryly at that. They entered the assembly hall. Rows of Ganas took the customary place of the principal devas. Between Rudra and the Ganas roared a gigantic sacrificial fire, into which were poured incessant streams of offerings. Ghee, herbs, scented wood, honeyed sweets, causing the flames to sputter and sparkle in different colors. The drone of the Vedic chants and the mantras invoking and placating the formidable Rudra made the marble floor and the gilded walls vibrate. Daksha took his officiating place next to the fire. Sati looked for an empty seat. The only vacant spot appeared to be right in the front, near the fire and her father. She sank to her feet to sit cross-legged on the floor. She tried to meditate but could not take her eyes off Rudra. He sat on a golden throne covered with a tiger skin, one emerald green cobra coiled on the gilded edge of the throne behind his neck. At his side were his Trishula, the gleaming trident, and the Damaru. At his feet sat the majestic Nandi, watching the crowd with half hooded eyes. Rudra's eyes were closed, his body motionless, deep in trance. His body was the color of a stormy sea, a gray, white, green hue. The rivulets of the Ganga flowed over him, bathing him tenderly, and she felt suddenly jealous of the great river. His hands rested lightly on his lap. His face was etched like stone, a faint smile playing at the edges of his lips, dark red against the pale skin of his face. When Sati could not bear any longer the splendor of his face, her eyes traveled to his hair. It was loose and untamed, more luxurious than the mane of a lion, more beautiful than black silk. It was red and black and golden all at once, exposed to and reflecting the elements of sun, wind, fire, and desert air. It was elemental. He was elemental. Sati peered into the fire pit. She could see all the mortals in all the worlds paying obeisance to Rudra. Thieves called out to him as the lord of thieves. Hunters called out to him as the lord of the hunters. Traders called out to him as the chief of traders. And so did the fishermen. Cowherds, women carrying water from wells, all the creatures of the forests and plains and seas called out to him. Even the plants undulated their leaves and dropped blossoms as offerings to him. On the cremation grounds, in the mountain caves, in the forests under millions of trees, Rudra was worshipped by all. Sati looked at Rudra again as night fell. Around her, most of the devas had fallen into deep meditation. Sati still could not bring herself to close her eyes. The shadows lengthened on the walls and then transformed into forms of Rudra. In some, his throat was black, and in some, it was white. In some, his hair was matted and he was bearded. In others, he was clean shaven. He was visible inside dark thunder clouds and in the lightning, too. He glittered in the clouds and mingled with the rain and sunshine. He appeared in the deep waters and in the dewdrops. He was hidden in the thorny, dense forest, and yet stood always before those who were his devotees. His arms carried thousands of weapons, yet his face remained peaceful and compassionate, the plains of his face smooth and radiant.
Beautiful, beautiful. I just love the descriptions that are there, and I know in our texts in both Itihasa and Puranas, they're replete with beautiful descriptions of the gods, and when they appear in all their, when they manifest themselves and all. But it's uh, it's still fascinating to read such descriptions. Beautiful. Uh, Coming back to my question, so there are among the last things in your book. One is the family of Shiva and Parvati, how it comes into being, and the second one is uh, this. Tell us a little bit about this fight or discord that appears, and how this impending battle against I shouldn't even say spoilers, because I think almost everyone knows about it. But still, I mean, for let's not spoil the surprise. So it's the creation of this obstacle, ironically at the hands of Shiva's boon himself, that now has to be dealt with. And for that, all Ganesha and Kartikeya, they have to come together. Tell us a little bit about that discord.
Sure. So it's interesting because it is there in the Puranas. So this kind of sense of rivalry between, I would say, Kartik and Ganesha, and they have this competition on who can go around the world the fastest, and whoever will be married off first. And so, in short, Ganesha wins that by using his wit, even though Karthik is he's the commander of the armies of the Devas, and he's physically very very fit and all of that. And so Karthik is angry about that, and he kind of leaves the home. Um, but while that is there, there's still very much a family. So, for example, in the Skanda Purana, at least the southern versions of that, There's a story when Kartikeya is wooing Valli, and he actually calls upon Ganesha to help him. So there is this brotherhood that remains, even though we have hints of these conflicts. And in Bengal, when we have Durga Puja, for example, that is meant to be the time, like the one time a year when Ma Durga comes home, comes to Earth, and is reunited with her family, including both the children. So it's a sense that they come together at times, but at other times they're apart, and there's sometimes some elements of tension, but of course they're always still a family. And so the way I thought about exemplifying that is the story of Tripura, and there's this a very powerful asura who have this boon that they can only be killed when these three cities are perfectly aligned at one particular moment. And so it
Correct.
happens in the Puranas, and there are different versions of this. But essentially, what happens is all of the devas come together, and there's a chariot that's used, and there's a particular arrow, and there's a bow, and all the devas are there together, and they've come together to defeat to win against Tripura. And and the way it's beautifully described is that Shiva, he just simply smiles, and at the right moment, and then just at that, with that smile, Tripura is destroyed. So actually none of the other devas and nothing else is needed in that moment. But he still releases the arrow, and he does that because he wants to show that even though he is powerful enough to take care of everything himself, it's really about the devas coming together and doing it all together. That's important and should be celebrated. And so I thought that was a beautiful theme to apply to this to the parivar, so the Shiva parivar, because each of them is is Bhagavan or Ishvara in their own right. Each is completely self-sufficient and independent, but there's a different beauty and lila that comes when they come together as a family, and that's really what we're celebrating. So I just thought thematically that fit well.
And if you're talking about our gods, and if you're talking about families, and if there are disputes or feuds or disagreements, then there's one person who's usually at behind all of that, right?
Yes. Narada.
Exactly.
And I
And
think it's
he,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, I was going to say that, and he plays he plays his role to perfection even here in your book.
Yes, he's always he always appears meddlesome, and he puts all these conflicts into motion. But it's actually why he is such a great Muni, is because through these stories that seem like they're, bad things are happening or there are conflicts, but great things come out of that. So we get great lessons, and there's always a good ending or a good resolution to it. So he's like the catalyst for a lot of the lila that's there in our Puranas and our and our Itihasa.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I want to switch gears now, and I'll talk about some of the things that I almost always try and talk about, which is the craft of writing. Tell us about your writing process. When you So let's take the Vow of Parvati specifically as an example. So when you started to write it, obviously, said you did your research. Your primary source is the Shiv Puran. Now, from the Shiv Puran, then when you have to construct the story, it obviously is not a sort of a verse by verse, a shloka by shloka translation, or slightly modified translation. There's a proper story in there. How did you go about constructing the plot for your story?
So this has been something that's been about a bit of an evolution for me. So I think I'm kind of the type of person, if I'll have an idea in my head and I'll just write it out without necessarily giving it shape and things like that. And I've learned the hard way that's not an efficient way of doing it. So there is a part of storytelling, I think, before you write a single word of a draft, where you look at what some people call like the shape of a story. So you have, let's say you have I think every book starts with a premise, and that premise would be something like a what if, or here's the idea, or a concept, and that can usually be there in one sentence. And then I think what you have to figure out is your characters, and then what are their core conflicts, which is usually a difference between what they want and what they need. um, and then you have to figure out what's the hardest way for them, um, what's the hardest antagonist that they could face, and that's really going to drive them um, to grow. And so I think those are kind of the basic ingredients. And then I think, there's a lot of elaborate structures out there. Like they have something called like Save the Cat, where you have like a number of different beats and you just kind of fill out each beat. But I think like a simple 3-act structure kind of helps in just broadly thinking about plots. So you have the first part, which is just the setup, and then you have something that's called the inciting incident. So that should be something where something happens to the character, and then they can't go back. So, for example, in the Vow of Parvati, the protagonist, as it were, is really Sati, and for her, the inciting incident would be the first time she encountered Shiva, because after that, she can't go back to life as it used to be. And then there's some kind of conflict or choice that has to be made in the first act. And then the second act is kind of you have like the conflicts, the stakes keep growing, and then there's kind of this midpoint where all seems lost, or where things seem very very bad. And so for me, that was kind of when the Daksha Yajna happens. And then the third act is how you kind of have resolution, and kind of the turning point, and all of that. Um, so that was kind of broadly how I structured it. And so the one thing where I deviated a little bit from what I'd say a classical plot structure is um, that I included the parts with the families, so with Karthik and Ganesha and Tripura at the end. So like they generally say you shouldn't introduce new characters in like the last third of the book. But I really wanted to bring that in, so I deviated from the structure there. But I think it's really about um, sometimes I just writing on a piece of paper, just drawing the arc of the story. So they say you start with your protagonist. Do they start off in a high place where things are going well, or in a low place where things are not going well? And is there dynamism where they're going from high to low, and there's some growth or some change, or is it too flat, and things like that? And so I think plotting the story, or just trying to look at it visually, sometimes is very helpful. So for me,
Hmm.
the main difference from when I first started writing is spending a lot more time thinking about the shape of the story, and the dynamism of it, um, and what the plot arc looks like, than just writing words.
So, uh, okay, so you have your source material, and you have the story arc plotted out, the inciting incident, and then essentially, the stakes keep getting higher, and then you have the low point, the absolute low point from which then, the sort of the story only moves upwards, and you've say written out a draft. When you read the draft, I'm sure you would be finding things that don't resonate well, or they seem to be reading a little too slow. How do you identify those sections? Because as an author, I can imagine that whatever one has written, that's the absolute last word in perfection. But obviously, one needs to put on a more critical eye. How do you go about that process?
So I think that the key is to do it in stages, and this is kind of what happened to me in that story I've abandoned, which is I wrote a draft, I was dissatisfied with it, and then I tried to do too much at once. So I was trying to fix like plot movement, plus like character issues, plus like all these things at once, and just became overwhelming. And then what happens is I have a second draft that was like a totally different story, but then I missed elements from the first draft and I tried to bring them together, but then it's like a weird mishmash of things, and then I just kind of threw my hands up in despair. I think the better approach to editing is you just start looking at one thing at a time. And so probably the first thing is just looking at, I think, the plot. So maybe it's like, I really like Scrivener for this, where you have those index cards. Um, and each of the index cards in the outline can just be like a scene. It can be a description of a scene. And sometimes when you're just looking at that cork board, or you're just looking at cards with the scene descriptions, you can see, is the scene adding something? Is there really a character growth? Is it adding to the overall story, or is it just kind of fluff? And I think you have to be ruthless in taking out scenes, rearranging scenes, maybe adding scenes, and redoing, I think, that outline almost. And then I think if you have that right, then you can go to the second order things around just like tightening up language or descriptions, sometimes the world building and settings, dialogue, things like that. But I think it's really just getting the arc of the plot that's often the hardest. And once that's right, and you kind of have like the spine or the skeleton of the story, everything else is a bit easier. But I found it's getting the skeleton right that's the hardest part, and nothing is more frustrating than writing a full draft and realizing you have the skeleton a bit off. So I think it's I think that's I think the more time we spend before we write anything getting the skeleton right is good. And I think what I found happening now that I try to write more like that is it may be a bit slower in the beginning, but then I can kind of catch myself. If I read a few chapters, but then it doesn't seem to be right, and then you can adjust the outline and things like that. But I think keeping like the macro always at the heart of it, and while working on the micro is helpful. But yeah, I
So,
think focusing on one thing at a time. And
mm,
I know you've recommended this book with the what is it, self editing for fiction
for
writers,
fiction
or
writers, right?
yes, it's just a great book.
Oh, thank you. That is a wonderful book. In case people are wondering what this is about, this is the book's title is Self-Editing for Fiction Writers, and I'll see if I can post a link to that book. I would strongly encourage anyone who's serious about writing, and more importantly, serious about improving their writing, to take a look at this book. We also have a weekly writers open house with Otis that takes place on Sundays, where we invite people to send in their writing pieces, 800 to 1,000 words long. And Otis is Stanford's Stegner Fellow. He will review, he will give his feedback, and those are invaluable lessons. We record those and they are put up on YouTube. I think we have had about 56 or 55 of the sessions so far. Uh, what I was going to ask you, Aditi, is that the final draft of the Vow of Parvati, I think, comes in at about 55,000 words.
Yes.
So when you had finished the draft, and obviously there are some corrections, changes, and other things. So roughly, how much did you end up cutting out?
I I think the longest it was around close to 65, maybe 70,000. So yeah, about 10.
So you're talking about cutting almost roughly 20% from the first draft.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think that I think is a true test if you're willing to cut things from a draft rather than add. Uh,
And you know that they weren't I wouldn't say they were bad scenes. It's just scenes that were they didn't add anything. So maybe you have like one scene of uh like Sati and having a conversation with Shiva. And there's another scene where they're having like another conversation. It's a little bit different. It's nice, but it doesn't add anything that the first scene doesn't already capture. So even though it's kind of like nice, and like as an author, you like it and you enjoy it, you enjoy being in that world, but it's not adding anything. You have to just be ruthless and take it out.
no, so true, so true. Because a lot of good writing advice is said, kill your darlings. And
Yes.
even though we are not obviously talking about this in the literal sense, it's more metaphorical. But I think the fact that if we like two characters and we want to write about them because it just gives us a lot of joy and pleasure, doesn't mean that the craft of writing dictates that we also follow that. So I think a 20% reduction is great. Uh, I have I have one more question, which is. Now, given that we have a lot of books coming out in this particular genre, we have some great writers coming out with books. At some point, if someone wants to write about Puranic characters, Puranic episodes, what would your advice be to them? Because the fact is that all of these stories have been told and retold and reimagined, some with great success, some with not so the results have not been so great. But if some writer out there is thinking, he's watching, they're watching this and they're thinking, hey, I have this particular story or these episodes from the Puranas that I want to write about, and I think I have a great idea, what would your advice to them would be if they are interested in getting published through the traditional route? Because obviously getting self-published is one way to go. Getting using something like the Kindle platform to publish your own book is another way to go. But if they're more interested in the traditional route of publishing, what would your advice be?
So this is something I've always heard people say, and to be honest, I've only appreciated more recently how important this is. But it's really to become widely read in the genre. So if you like this genre of itihasic and Puranic fiction, first is to read all the books that are out there that you can read. And the reason for this is one, because if you're going to write in a genre, you want to understand how it's been done, what has made other books successful, and what is out there. And also, the more you read, the better you'll become as a writer. But I think the other important thing is if you go to a publisher, what they're going to want to know, you can write a very wonderful book, but if it is very similar to other books that are out there and you're a new author, there's no ready-made marketplace for it. So just the same way if you're an entrepreneur and you're creating a product, you have to have some differentiation. So you have to understand as an author, first of all, you want to be close enough in that genre so that people who are reading that genre want to read your book because you're close to some others. And this is what in the industry are called comps. So like comparable titles that have done relatively well that you want to be categorized with. So you can think of this: if you go to Amazon, you order a book, and it'll show you below, books that are related to the book that you've chosen. So who are the authors, or which are the books you want to be associated with, and you want to think about that, and then you want to think about, but what makes this book different from all of the other books that are out there? So how can you make it new? And so it's both of these things. So thinking about what's similar and how you're capitalizing on what's out there, and then how you're making it different. And so this kind of positioning is very important. I think it's also important to do a lot of good research. And I know you're having a Q&A coming up with Shibibek Debroy, who I'm just such a big admirer of, because for people like me who read in English, for a long time the Puranas have been kind of inaccessible, or if there are English translations, they're very archaic or not very good. But he writes and he translates so smoothly that you can read it so easily. And he's already translated so many of the Puranas, the full Mahabharata, the Ramayana. And so there's no excuse now not to read the source material, even if you're reading and writing in English. So I really recommend reading all of his books, reading across different Puranas. A wonderful resource is the Puranic Encyclopedia. So doing that research, and then making it your own, and just again reading a lot in the genre, and then thinking how you can make it new, and position yourself a little bit differently. And I do think for anyone who writes in this genre, we just have this responsibility to not distort. So it is fiction, so we're going to take creative liberties, and that's fine. But these are sacred literature, it's a sacred tradition. There's an underlying values or an ethos or a meaning to all of this. and that should be respected and not tampered with. So I think it's being cognizant of that responsibility is a very important ethical obligation all of us writers have in this area.
Oh, so very true. I think this last point that you brought up, that simply because that corpus of literature is available to us, it does not give us the right to distort, misrepresent, or to apply some modern, postmodern lenses to it. I think, and my take on that has been that you have to have, if you're interpreting something, you have to have, it has to come from Shraddha, and you have to ask yourself, do you have the adhikar to do that?
Hmm. Yes.
Which I think is somewhat anathema to today's ethos of me, myself, and I, me, myself, and I have the right. So anyway, that's a topic for, I think, a whole other discussion. Uh, any last words for us, Aditi?
I would just say, I hope it's been wonderful to see so many new authors coming out of the Indic space. I think a lot of it from what Indica is doing. So I just encourage people to keep reading and keep writing. And to definitely take advantage of the open house sessions you mentioned with Otis. I cannot emphasize enough, and I think I've said this before, but I've taken many creative writing classes in the US. There's I've never come across a teacher who's as inspiring and just as good as Otis. And then the fact that Indica makes this available for free is really stupendous. And I really hope people take advantage of that, because if you are taking these classes in the US and Otis is from Stanford, you'd be paying tens of thousands of dollars. That and it's a really great opportunity. So I always plug that.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree and endorse that. We do get people who regularly send in writing submissions, and lots of great feedback that is given by Otis. So you can head over to the Indica website for more details. You can tweet to us at Indica Books if you want more information. These sessions are held every Sunday at 8 p.m. India time. So invite you to join them. So, folks, we have been in discussion with Aditi Banerjee, who is the author of The Vow of Parvati, The Story of a Love Reborn. It's been published by Bloomsbury. It is available on in retail as well as online stores. You can head over to Flipkart, Amazon, and purchase a paperback copy. It's also available as a Kindle ebook edition. If you buy the book, which I'm sure you will, please also do leave a review and a rating, because these are important signals, and they give a lot of feedback to other people who are looking to buy or read these books. So your rating, your review does go a long way in helping others make up their mind. Uh, we will put this video up on YouTube, and do join us in the conversation on Twitter, on Facebook, and thank you, Aditi, for this wonderful Q&A, and all the best with your book.
Thank you, Abhinav. It's always so much fun talking to you. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, folks.